Start the session to keep as much time for the speakers. I think there is a friendly competition between Cambridge and Vienna for the most exciting intellectual place in the first half of the 20th century. And I think most people in the audience know that my bias is clearly with Vienna, and I'm very happy that we have three wonderful speakers today who are going to prove once and for all that Vienna indeed was the most exciting intellectual place of the first half of the 20th century. I know that Wittgenstein was in doubt, but I'm sure that Max, Simon, and Erik will once and for all settle the matter. First, we're going to have Max, who's a PhD student at Harvard, and he is going to talk about the socialist calculation debate in Vienna. Max, go ahead. Looks good.
Thank you, Erwin, and thank you all for joining us today. In 1920, Ludwig von Mises published an article in which he argued that a rational allocation of resources to their most productive uses would be impossible in a socialist society. Productivity can only be calculated in terms of the prices of goods. Prices are expressed in money, and money, he believed, derived its existence from ownership and exchange, from the institutions of private property and the market. The essential concept in this argument is that of calculation, specifically calculation in the sense of accounting. The calculation of the return on capital, which measured the productivity of a firm or a branch of production, was a bookkeeping procedure. Mises' concern with bookkeeping is, I think, apparent to most of his readers, yet historians have not related his writings to contemporary accounting theory and practice. Doing so clarifies the ambiguous relationships among calculation, accounting, and rationality as they were understood by Mises and other social scientists at the time. On the one hand, rationality was regarded as a form of accounting. Accounting was the paradigmatic expression of rational thought, the historical origin of a rational worldview, and an indispensable basis for rational action. On the other hand, Mises' contemporaries were apprehensive about the seemingly inexorable reduction of the world to bookkeeping principles, its rationalization in an accounting sense. This ambivalence characterizes Mises' own work and influenced the later development of the socialist calculation debate that began with his 1920 publication. Rationality as accounting seems to have been too limiting a concept to describe the economic process. Later generations of Austrian economists would seek other categories for interpreting 20th century society. Mises' writings on socialist calculation are part of a considerable accounting literature in German produced in the early 20th century. Scholars at the time argued that capitalism could be defined by accounting practices. In business and trade schools, young people read accounting textbooks to prepare for careers in a growing profession, and housewives were exhorted to keep accurate accounts for their families to ensure order and respectability in the home. Around the turn of the century, a kind of accounting mania seized German-speaking social scientists and householders alike, who saw keeping the books as the characteristic technique of rational modernity. At the time Mises wrote, accounting was understood as the basis both of certain institutional forms of capitalism and of economic rationality, of the rational allocation of the means of production to their most efficient uses via the calculation of a return on capital. Mises' own contribution, I think, was to argue the converse. Not only was accounting necessary for capitalism, capitalism was necessary for accounting and for rationality too. Rationality, not only in the economic sense, but also in the broadest sense, encompassing science and ethics. This was another theme Mises' work had in common with the accounting discourse of the time. His 1920 article is a detailed treatment of bookkeeping practices. He mentions amortization and depreciation and the allocation of overhead costs. His metaphors are drawn from accounting textbooks and popular literature. The phrase he uses to describe the socialist planning agency's accounting, Toppeln im Dunkeln, or in the US, one might say, shooting in the dark, was also used, for example, by the statistician Ernst Engel in an 1882 lecture addressed to housewives on the importance of accurate household accounts. And Mises' image of bookkeeping as a ship's compass used to navigate through the turbulent waters of the dynamic economy is even older. As the natural philosopher Titius of Wittenberg wrote in 1780, it is self-evident that the accounts must be kept complete and accurate if they are to be the compass of the household. Mises' thesis is that accounting is only possible in the context of private property and market exchange. He refers to his earlier book, The Theory of Money and Credit, to show how, in the context of private property, money develops as a medium of exchange, reducing heterogeneous wants to a common measure. This common measure is what makes economic rationality possible. Heterogeneous inputs to production can be compared in terms of price, and a single metric of productivity can be calculated. The observation that accounting depended on a common denominator, money, was a frequent one among contemporary authors, but Marxists claimed that labor could also function as a common denominator in place of money. Mises therefore reviews Böhm-Bawerk's arguments against the classical labor theory of value. Bookkeeping must account not only for the cost of labor, but also for the time value of money, that is interest on capital, and for the cost of scarce natural goods such as land and minerals, that is rent. Mises' article is thus one of several major works by German-speaking social scientists of the period to examine the place of accounting in the capitalist order. Other texts include Max Weber's Economy and Society and Philosophy of Money, which had a profound influence on Mises. But in the remainder of my time today, I'm going to talk about Mises' relationship to Werner Sombart. Mises showed in a critical review published in 1925 that he knew Sombart's work well. And Sombart's article on bookkeeping, The Origin of the Capitalist Enterprise, appeared 4 years before Mises' article on calculation in the same journal, the Archive for Social Science and Social Policy. But although there are striking analogies in articles, I don't want to claim that Mises derives specific premises from Sombart's writings. Rather, I take Sombart as representative of a certain contemporary attitude toward accounting and rationality that Mises took up and, crucially, reworked. Sombart argued that capitalism's historical development depended on double entry bookkeeping, first systematized in a textbook by Luca Pacioli in 1494. Double entry bookkeeping enables investments in productive assets to be recorded on a separate account from other expenses. This account came to be known as the capital account. For Sombart, capital is ultimately an accounting concept. The same is true of the other basic categories of economic theory, including fixed and circulating capital, return on capital, and crucially, production costs. Accounting separately for the cost of production enables entrepreneurs to calculate the most efficient use of capital, according to Sombart. Inputs could then be compared quantitatively in terms of a common denominator, money. Thus, to economize means to calculate, Sombart wrote. And double entry bookkeeping was paramount not only for capitalism, but for rationality generously construed. Three themes can be identified in Sombart's statement as accounting. First, double entry ensured the objectivity of the firm and its economic operations by describing them in terms that were legible not only to the entrepreneur, but to other parties as well. Second, double entry was a mechanical process, subject to strict formal rules. And because the firm's accounts could be kept by anyone and read by anyone, the identity of the owner or partners was irrelevant. Finally, then, double entry bookkeeping rendered capitalism impersonal. Double entry distinguished the accounts of the entrepreneur from those of the enterprise, the household of the prince from the investments. For Sombart, double entry bookkeeping encoded an entire rational, distinctly modern worldview, an image of a mechanical, objective universe governed by impersonal forces. He believed that what the natural science of Galileo and Newton had accomplished in the physical world, double entry bookkeeping accomplished in the social. Like Zombart, Mises also thought that accounting and the institutional forms of capitalism were intimately related. The concept of capital is derived from economic calculation. Its true home is accountancy, the chief instrument of commercial rationality, Mises wrote. Both authors understood commercial rationality, or rationality in the economic sense, as integral to rationality as such. In fact, Mises did not really distinguish between the two. All rational action involved a choice among ends based on comparisons of value and was therefore economic. Under socialism, Mises asked, would there in fact be any such thing as rational conduct at all, or indeed such a thing as rationality and logic and thought itself? Historically, Mises continued, human rationality is a development of economic life. Could it then obtain when divorced therefrom? Zombart and Mises shared this understanding of accounting significance with other social scientists at the time. But in many respects, this theory of accounting and its associated concept of rationality were ill-suited to the kinds of arguments that interested Mises. First, although Zombart described accounting as rational precisely because it was a mechanical procedure, Mises insisted in a 1924 article that mechanical procedures were obviously inadequate under dynamic conditions. Second, Zombart described accounting as an objectifying technique, delineating the basic concepts of economic theory, including, crucially, production costs. And Mises would have forcefully denied that production costs are objective quantities. Accountancy data is of necessity historical, consisting entirely of transactions recorded in the past. It does not describe the savvy entrepreneur's subjective expectations regarding an uncertain future. Finally, while Zombart believed that accounting rendered capitalist enterprise impersonal, Mises insisted that the entrepreneur's personal qualities and personal relationship to the business remained critical. According to Zombart, double entry accounting enabled anyone to keep the books for the firm. And contemporaries agreed there was no need for the manager to have a property stake in the firm in order to make rational economic decisions. The manager could be a salaried agent of the state. Lenin thought that the manager of the socialist firm would act as a kind of disinterested auditor. But for Mises, it was not the, and I quote, complacently prosperous managing director resembling a civil servant who made firms succeed, but instead, Mises wrote, the manager, promoter, and man of affairs who is himself interested as a shareholder. And simply introducing accounting techniques into socialized firms would not be enough to replace self-interest. Mises wrote, the attributes of the businessman cannot be divorced from the position of the entrepreneur in the capitalist order. A man does not become a businessman by passing some years in commercial training or in a commercial institute, nor by a knowledge of bookkeeping and the jargon of commerce, nor by a skill in languages and typing and shorthand, nor, Mises added, by, quote, the adoption of certain technical office appliances, such as typewriters, copying machines, etc. Here, Mises suggests that successful economic action depended on more than just the techniques and technology of bookkeeping. Economic action is a matter not only of rationality, but of interest as well. The passage I just cited, wonderfully evocative of changes in business practices around the turn of the century, appears at the end of the 1920 article as an afterthought. Mises suggests that the personal status of the entrepreneur is in fact not directly related to his thesis concerning accounting's dependence on the institutions of private property in the market, which give rise to money, the common denominator required for bookkeeping calculations. After all, a calculation is a calculation, regardless of who carries it out. But as the socialist calculation debate continued, the economic process was reconceptualized and the role of accounting diminished. For authors such as Zombart, to economize had been simply to calculate, to keep the books according to an impersonal, objective technique subject to formal rules. This definition did not describe the forms of personal knowledge that Friedrich Hayek, Michael Polanyi, and others saw as lacking from centrally planned economies. Such knowledge could not be systematized, codified, or quantified. And the concept of economic rationality as accounting would have tended to include collective decision-making by the market, envisioned as a kind of information or signal processor performing calculations of a very different kind. This vast and complex device might not refer to bookkeeping values at all, but only to the purely qualitative and subjective expectations of participants in the market. And finally, accounting has very little to do with leadership, one of the entrepreneur's main virtues, according to later economists of the Austrian school. I'll conclude by suggesting that this school became frustrated with the early 20th century interpretation of rationality typified by Zombart's work. Understood as objectivity, impersonality, and mechanical adherence to rule, rationality lost coherence as a category for making sense of modern life. These economists sought other theories of the wants, desires, and subjective values that were the motive power in the economic process. My colleagues on the panel will discuss the psychological inquiry in more detail, and I'm very much looking forward to their papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. That was wonderful. Like I posted in the chat, we're gonna keep the Q&A we're gonna have the Q&A at the very end of the session, because the papers hang very closely together, as Max already hinted. So the next presentation is by Simon Torracinta, who is a PhD student at Yale in the history of science, and who is going to talk about some of the psychologists that were active right next to the economist in Vienna. So Simon, go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay,
Again, there's about 20 minutes, right?
Great. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm also reading a Word document at the same time, so hopefully it will work. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks to everyone for joining us virtually. So I think, as you'll tell from Max's paper and mine, one of the aims of this panel is to liberate the quote-unquote socialist calculation debate from an overly present-oriented and sometimes narrowly disciplinary historiography, which often tends to group together many distinct events and ideas under that single monolithic heading, and instead to return it to its distinctive early 20th century Viennese scientific and intellectual context. So it's in that spirit that I want to today present a bit of my dissertation, which as a whole examines debates concerning the nature of human desires and behavior across the human sciences, especially in economics and psychology at the turn of the century. So rather than focusing on questions of planning, coordination, calculation, or technical feasibility, like much of the subsequent literature, I want instead to reframe the initial exchange between Otto Neurath and Ludwig von Mises in 1919-1920 as also concerned with deeper epistemological and philosophical problems over the relationship between feeling, desire, utility, and value, and the possibility or not of measurement and comparison. I think doing so helps us understand their positions not just as the outcome of the immediate post-war economic situation in Central Europe, nor merely as the byproduct of a priori political commitments, but rather as embedded in a longer debate within the human sciences of fin de siècle Vienna. And I think it also helps us to see, despite their famous disagreement, what Neurath and Mises believed in common. So, all right. Before getting to them though, I first want to outline three intellectual developments as context. So first is the fall in the epistemological confidence in introspective data in German-speaking psychology. Second, the debate over value between the so-called first and second Austrian schools. And third, the work of a Czech economist named Franz Kuhel. So just to get to, part two. So the cornerstone of scientific practice putatively involved a strong commitment to intersubjective confirmation, for which the experiment had for centuries served as a particularly dramatic symbol. But this posed a serious problem for psychology. Internal mental phenomena like feelings, including states of pleasure or satisfaction, though notionally available to everyone individually, were not subject to external confirmation. Already by the mid-19th century, philosophers like Auguste Comte had used this obstacle to dismiss the epistemological validity of introspective data outright. The problem proved particularly thorny within German-speaking psychology, given its long-standing emphasis on both the powerful faculty of feeling and on the empirical study of the mind. So it was within this context that German psychologist Franz Brentano felt it necessary to defend the scientific use of introspection. In the 1860s and 1870s, Brentano established a school at the University of Vienna that proved profoundly influential in shaping the Germanic mental sciences at the turn of the century. In his landmark Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint in 1874, Brentano argued that the self-evident reality of mental states actually made psychology superior science. Physicists, for example, could only make do with the signs of physical phenomena, not the phenomena in themselves. But the phenomena of inner perception were, Brentano claimed, true in themselves. But despite this confidence, Brentano also maintained that a reformation and restriction of research methods was required. Psychologists had to abandon the broad practice of what he called inner observation, and instead limit themselves to what he termed inner perception, in which mental phenomena were only perceived out of the corner of the mind's eye, so to speak, indirectly. Most significantly for our purposes here, he also raised the problem of generalizability, since, quote, someone else can no more apprehend my mental phenomena through inner perception than I can those that belong to him. This method thus had to be supplemented with indirect knowledge and the possibility of intersubjective confirmation through, quote, mutually intelligible communication, end quote. So many psychologists committed to a scientific vision followed in Brentano's footsteps, and it would be his contemporary Wilhelm Wundt who most successfully operationalized his ideas. Borrowing Brentano's distinction between self-observation and internal perception, Wundt formalized the latter into a full experimental practice, although he imposed severe limitations on what it could record. Establishing the first psychological laboratory at Leipzig in 1879, staged in this photograph here, Wundt developed a method that sought to trigger discrete mental events, quickly reported by a practiced observer and recorded before memory could work as distortions, at least allegedly. But under such highly restrictive conditions, only simpler and more automatic mental processes like sensation and perception were available for experimental investigation and especially for measurement. And Wundt notably excluded, quote, feelings and their complex connections, affects, and processes of volition, end quote, from its remit. The upshot here was that a scientifically valid measure for comparing states of feeling now appeared impossible. Okay, next part. So as I'm sure you know, economics in Austria in this period was being thoroughly remade by the marginalist work of Karl Menger, Friedrich von Wieser, and Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, the so-called First Austrian School of Value. But this shift to subjective psychic foundations opened up new questions in the borderlands of economics and psychology for philosophers and psychologists interested in questions of desire and value. These included none other than Franz Brentano and the students of his school, especially Christian von Ehrenfeld, one of the founders of Gestology. Ehrenfeld's meta-ethical work on value theory in the 1890s, part of the so-called Second Austrian School of Value, culminated in his two-volume System of Value Theory in 1897-98, which directly criticized the Austrian marginalists for an overly narrow economic conception of value. Following Brentano, Ehrenfeld sought to construct a general theory of value on psychological foundations, in which economic value would only be a subset. The treatise took care to distinguish feeling from desire. Feeling, which could be placed on a scale of pleasure to pain, was clearly important as a source of motivation, but only desire was directed at objects in the world. While both were linked, in the final analysis, Ehrenfeld argued it was desires, not feelings, that determined values. Finally, while he had drawn on psychological introspection to supply the intuitions for his own theory, he also followed Brentano in admitting that introspective data could not settle matters of dispute, leaving open new doubts about the problem of comparison, measurement, and commensuration. Okay, next part. So the culmination of these debates at this turn of the century in Vienna had a powerful influence on a relatively obscure Czech economist named František, or the Germanized Franz Kuhel. Kuhel had studied law in both Vienna and Prague before entering a job at the Prague Chamber of Commerce, where he rose through the ranks while nursing a desire to enter academia and habilitate into the prestigious Austrian field of Nationalökonomie. An early retirement due to illness in 1903 and a move to Vienna gave him the time and resources to devote to his intellectual ambitions. In 1907, he published his economic and psychological treatise on the theory of needs. Kuhel sought to reconcile the two Austrian schools of value in the book in order to provide the new foundations for economic science, systematically locating value not as a property of objects, but as a product of desires. But he was also aware of the problem of psychological measurement and comparison that had been raised by Brentano and Ehrenfeld. Following Ehrenfeld, Kuhel argued that positive and negative feelings functioned as, quote, decisive regulators of our desires, end quote. But this did not mean that the hedonists were correct. In fact, the link between desire and feeling was necessarily mediated by cognition, which sought to comprehend, and not always correctly, the causes of and means to welfare. So I made a slide to try to explain this because it gets a little complicated. From this premise, Kuhel distinguished three kinds of desires at different levels of remove. Welfare desire at the bottom there for improving one's subjective welfare, which led to use desire for the means of satisfaction, and finally possession desires for possessing such means of satisfaction. And he used this trinity to place conventional economic categories on mental foundations. So according to Kuhel, stripped of metaphysics, utility was really just a kind of use indexed collective possession desires. In Kuhl's conclusion, this made the boundaries between economic science and other disciplines like psychology since economics was solely concerned with actions aimed at use and possession, their actual link to welfare was not important to the economist. And given the division of labor in the sciences, disciplines could safely outsource research into the causes behind, quote, given facts and quantities to other fields, in this case, psychology. With these moves, Kuhel thus attempted to solve the problem of introspective comparison raised by Brentano and Ehrenfeld. Economists could stop at use desires without worrying about their complex cognitive derivation from feelings. Psychologists could worry about the latter, but it had no bearing for economics. So Kuhel explicitly positioned use desire at what he, quote, called the, quote, border station, that's his term, what in STS today we might call a boundary object, between economic science and its neighbors. Psychologists might investigate the link between welfare desire and use desire, and economists the link between use desire and possession desire, but explanations must be checked, so to speak, at the border. The reasons by which individuals decide what will make them happy is therefore of no concern to an economist. Put simply, people just want what they want. Thus, Kuhel explicitly cautions against an assumption of commensurability between desires. On an individual level, of course, desires could be and were compared. Quote, human willpower is so organized that only desire which surpasses all others existing simultaneously can become a person's will, end quote. And they compare them as if weighing two objects on a balance. But if such a balance might determine which object was heavier, it could not measure mass directly. And in the same way, the intensity and duration of desire could not be measured in units, but only graded on a scale. In addition, the needs of different individuals could not be compared at all, since, quote, we would not be able to establish the relation between their respective sizes with certainty, because in this case, we lack a tool for recognizing which is stronger, end quote. Now, Kuhel did not obtain the academic position he sought, and his theory of needs did not meet the success that he had hoped, but the work would have a decisive influence on the shape of the socialist calculation debate that kicked off just a decade later. So, final part. During the cataclysm of World War I, the travails on the home front of the Central Powers had made planning a central concern. Entente naval blockade led to acute shortages and rationing of food. Efforts to supply the war required novel techniques of state-led coordination of production. In Austria, as elsewhere, socialists were particularly eager to break with the economic liberalism of the empire and repurpose wartime techniques for post-war reconstruction. The director of the Department of War Economics at the War Ministry in Vienna, a young economist, and later Vienna Circle philosopher named Otto Neurath, became convinced that the ad hoc planning of war economics would give way to a rationally planned peacetime economy of, quote, what he called calculation in kind. Already by 1916, Neurath confidently declared that the war was affecting a hidden sea change in economic affairs. Quote, the practical importance of an independent in-kind calculus based off comprehensive consumption and production statistics is almost universally acknowledged today, but still more has happened. Not only has the in-kind calculus received attention, but the in-kind economy has also been favored at the expense of the monetary economy, end quote. The direct provisioning of wants and needs in wartime would quietly displace what Neurath felt was the indirect, inefficient, and unjust coordination of the market. Now, even outside wartime production, these questions were hardly abstract. In the defeated German Empire, revolutionaries in Munich declared the short-lived People's State of Bavaria, with Neurath electing to serve as president for the fledgling state's, short-lived state's Central Office of Economics in 1918. In a report to its plenary session in 1919, Neurath flatly declared that, quote, the organizations which have just been created by the requirements of war will be gladly taken over and carried on by the requirements of peace, end quote, creating an entirely administered society and socialized society. A new science of what he called universal statistics would produce the knowledge to, quote, satisfy the demands of masses of people, eradicating crises, income. Responding to Neurath's argument, the Austrian economist and civil servant Ludwig von Mises, then employed by the Viennese Chamber of Commerce, mounted a sharp theoretical attack. His 1920 essay, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, drew up an extensive list of charges against socialist economics, some of which we've already heard, and I will not try to rehearse here. But most significantly for our purposes and for this paper was Mises' reflection on the relationship between wants and prices and between needs and value. Every man, every man, wrote Mises, who in the course of economic life makes a choice between the satisfaction of one need as against another, eo ipso makes a judgment of value, end quote. Now, Neurath's ideal of an in-kind economy had proposed to do away with exchange value denoted in prices altogether and allocate goods solely in regard to their actual qualities, their use value for individuals. Mises insisted, by contrast, that valuation can only take place in terms of units, and that, quote, a unit of subjective values for goods, end quote, was simply impossible. The satisfaction of a given individual, their state of feeling, in other words, could never be compared directly with someone else's. Any decision from a central authority would therefore be imposing one set of values over others, curbing the freedom of choice possible within a market economy. Directly citing Kuhel, Mises further emphasized that the unique quality of market prices was their ability to perform this coordination between incommensurable values, because in the market, quote, judgments of value do not measure, they merely establish grades and scale. Recall the terminology, end quote. Recall the terminology, that's not in the quote. Ultimately, quote, the subjective use value of each commodity is not immediately comparable as a purely individual phenomenon with the subjective use value of other men. It only becomes so in exchange value, which arises out of the interplay of the subjective valuations of all who take part in exchange, end quote. This produced a dual advantage for an exchange economy over a socialist one. It allowed for the coordination of incommensurable wants within a single economic system, and it made it possible to refer values back to a unit as the ultimate arbiter between clashing motivations. Hence the necessity of putting a price on the higher values, even spiritual ones, when it became necessary to consider them within economic decisions. But what was striking was that Neurath, for his part, had also accepted Kuhel's premise of the difficulties of comparing feelings between individuals. Despite his own idiosyncratic utilitarianism, what he sometimes called his felicitology, Neurath had himself argued in a 1912 lecture on the problem of the pleasure maximum that, quote, the concept of the total pleasure of the human group raises the further question of the comparability of one total pleasure with another, end quote. Indeed, quote, until today, we have not succeeded in calculating pleasure sums of groups of persons under all circumstances, nor even to state how such a calculation is to proceed, end quote. Nevertheless, he did maintain that informal comparisons could be and were made in daily life all the time. But thus, parents might give one son 2 concert tickets and none to the other, saying, "Your brother gets much more enjoyment from music than you," end quote. It was on the basis of this kind of pragmatic reasoning, informal reasoning, and not scientific measurement that, as philosopher John O'Neill has emphasized, Neurath's ideal of an in-kind economy aimed not to outsource questions of differing values to the informal coordination of market prices, but instead reserve them for democratic and political deliberation. Large-scale economic decisions always require judgments of value, end quote. We can see no possibility of reducing the production plan to some kind of unit and then to compare the various plans in terms of such unit, end quote. For Neurath, the only solution to incommensurable values was thus a deliberative one. And in this capacious theory of value, he was not so far from the inheritance of Brentano. Oh, sorry. So just to conclude, what had begun as a relatively narrow technical debate had raised a fundamental questions of economic theory and epistemology, and significant political ramifications. Relatively abstruse disagreements about the access to, measurability of, and comparability between feelings like want and pleasure turned out to have major historical stakes. But we will better understand the nature of this debate if we can see the shared premise that underlies it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simon. Our next speaker is Erik Baker, who, just like Max, is a PhD student at Harvard. And he is going to tell us about later debates around Viennese psychology, especially how they, I think, transpired in the post-World War II period. So, Erik, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I hope that everyone is ready to travel forward in time and across the Atlantic to see how some of these same themes transpired in a different historical context, but also to follow some of the specific individuals and ideas from their interwar Viennese context to the mid-century United States. So everyone, or at least most people, have seen this pyramid, physiological needs on the bottom, progressing upwards stratum by stratum to a pinnacle labeled self-actualization or self-fulfillment here. This, we are told, is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, an iconic image of 20th century psychology, social science. In some ways, psychology is equivalent to E equals MC squared, and like it, more widely recognized than understood. In fact, it's far from obvious how the pyramid actually ought to be understood. Maslow himself never drew it in his lifetime, and considered carefully, it provokes more questions than answers. Are there more physiological needs than belonging or esteem needs in a quantitative sense? Are they easier to come by? Are the higher needs built on top of the lower needs in some way? And what makes them higher in the first place? Though the pyramid might not be the most perspicuous representation of Maslow's theory, its ambiguity reflects an indeterminacy at the heart of his own understanding of his most enduring contribution to theoretical psychology. In truth, Maslow had no stable conception of the hierarchy of needs. It was a flexible tool, and the purpose to which Maslow most often deployed it was, perhaps surprisingly, political and economic argumentation. Maslow first developed the hierarchy of psychological needs in the early 1940s when he was living in New York and espoused a psychologically inflected social democratic leftism inspired by John Dewey and Erich Fromm, among others. By the time that Maslow died in 1969, he had decamped to Reaganist California and embraced a far more conservative philosophy that emphasized the need for strong leadership, especially by those special economic actors he called entrepreneurs. This political economic transformation was accompanied by, and in some ways articulated through, a crucial revision in Maslow's understanding of how the hierarchy of needs operated. Attending to this intertwined political, economic, and psychological evolution, therefore, underscores one of the central themes of this panel, that arguments about political economy can turn on seemingly quite subtle differences of psychological interpretation. For Abraham Maslow, as much as for the Viennese political economists of the early 20th century, to say something about markets, states, and political movements required you to also say something about the mind. As a young psychology professor at Brooklyn College in the late 30s and early 40s, Maslow was weaned from the behaviorism of his graduate training at the University of Wisconsin by a community of intellectuals who insisted that a more dynamic, psychoanalytic methodology could allow psychologists to shed light on the origins of what struck them as the single most pressing contemporary social problem, political authoritarianism, which had already uprooted some of them from their homes in Central Europe and seemed to possess a disturbing domestic analog in the conservative resistance to the New Deal. For the left-wing post-Freudian theorists with whom Maslow became acquainted, particularly Viennese alum Alfred Adler and Erik Fromm, support for authoritarianism was a manifestation of an individual's stunted psychological development. People sought to identify themselves with strongman leaders as compensation for their own egoic weakness. Racked by neurotic insecurity, they became susceptible to political slogans that emphasized security above all else. This underlying psychological inadequacy, Adler and Fromm maintained, was not the moral fault of the individual, but a symptom of broader social pathology. Inclined to what his Viennese contemporary Georg Lukács called romantic socialism, Adler emphasized the modern destruction of the organic community ties that had once provided individuals with a sense of belonging and social identity, while the Marxist Fromm emphasized the alienation of the capitalist labor process, the subordination of the individual worker to both the personal power of employers and the impersonal power of the market. In any case, the prescription was clear. Full victory over authoritarianism required the achievement of what Fromm called democratic socialism, a social revolution that would, quote, enhance the actual freedom, initiative, and spontaneity of the individual, and so obviate the need for dependence on authoritarian leaders. Maslow's landmark 1943 paper, modestly titled A Theory of Human Motivation, sought to synthesize this left-wing Freudian story with the vocabulary of psychological needs popularized by the Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. It was here that Maslow announced for the first time his claim that human needs arrange themselves in hierarchies of prepotency. Motivation at any given moment was, as Murray argued, an expression of a set of innate needs, running the gamut from the need for sustenance to the need for a sense of achievement and self-esteem. But the needs were not all jockeying with each other simultaneously, Maslow argued, or brought to the forefront unpredictably as a result of personal or cultural contingencies. Rather, they emerged in a universal determinate order and receded once fulfilled. Basic physiological needs and needs for belonging and social identity would predominate if they were unfulfilled, but if they were satisfied, they would give way to higher needs, culminating in the need for what the Gestalt theorist Kurt Goldstein called self-actualization, a sense that the individual is doing what he is fitted for in some ultimate fashion. This initial statement of the hierarchy of needs provided a clever framework for reconciling a materialist approach to political strategy and social theory with a liberal humanist anthropology. Individuality was sacred. The good life consisted in the achievement of a quasi-artistic practice of self-expression. But it was not possible for people to pull themselves up into self-actualization by their bootstraps. The flourishing individual was a social accomplishment, and the underdeveloped individual was a social failure. Man lives by bread alone when there is no bread, Maslow wrote. Neurosis was not randomly distributed, but disproportionately concentrated among the economic and social underdogs. These people were still governed by their unsatisfied safety needs, which all too often found expression in a search for a protector or a stronger person on whom he may depend, or perhaps a Führer. But if something like Fromm's democratic socialism managed to systematically satisfy the underdog's real need for security, one could expect that many of today's authoritarians would blossom into independent self-actualizers. Maslow did introduce one crucial caveat in the 1943 paper. In certain people, the level of aspiration may be permanently deadened or lowered, he speculated. In such individuals, the less prepotent goals may simply be lost, so those are the higher goals, and may disappear forever. The victim of chronic unemployment, Maslow speculated, might continue to be satisfied for the rest of his life if only he can get enough food. At this time, then, Maslow understood this hypothesis as fully compatible with the rest of his theorizing as a brief for social democratic policymaking. If chronic unemployment led to permanent psychological damage, all the more reason to take steps to eliminate chronic unemployment. During the 1950s and 1960s, however, the idea that people could remain psychologically deadened even when their material needs were satisfied became the anchor of Maslow's burgeoning political conservatism. Eventually, the specter drove Maslow to entirely discard the assumption that there was anything deterministic or predictable about individuals' movement up and down the hierarchy of needs. Maslow retained the hierarchy as a normative statement of which needs or aspirational modes were most dignified. But by the end of his life, he had come to reject the notion, still at the heart of textbook treatments of Maslow today, that the normal individual would progress upwards through the hierarchy by satisfying the lower needs sequentially. At the core of Maslow's political transformation was his wholesale embrace of the common idea that the post-war economic boom transported the United States into a state of affluence. Capitalist economic growth, he felt, had ensured the near universal satisfaction of basic needs that Maslow once assumed that social democratic policymaking would be necessary to guarantee. But at least in Maslow's view, the predicted flourishing of higher aspirations failed to materialize. Instead, plentiful material gratifications, cars, TV, fancy house, fine clothes, made temporary narcotizing distraction easy to come by, Maslow wrote. Wealth equals no need to delay, no training in frustration or self-denial, he warned. Life becomes more like an all-indulging mother and less like a stern, disciplining, frustrating father who metes out just desserts. As this analogy suggests, Maslow became convinced, like many contemporary male social scientists, that the ease and leisure of American consumer society was producing a crisis of masculinity. Why are US women so dominant, castrating, discontent, lousy wives, etc.? Maslow pondered in his diary. Why are US men so meek, sheepish, dominated? Why so often the marriage of weak husband, strong wife? This disturbing inversion of Maslow's preferred system of gender norms suggested that he had been too hasty in his earlier political ambition to conquer material hardship. Under the bad circumstances of today in the United States, he concluded there was simply, quote, no way of proving manhood. By the early 1960s, then, Maslow recognized that this train of thought had led him to a rapprochement with what he called Ayn Rand, Goldwater, Adam Smith conservatism. Its core insight, he believed, was that Americans needed to try harder to separate helping from overprotection, pampering, and thereby weakening. Like other conservatives of the 1960s, Maslow believed that the desire for overprotection and pampering was particularly acute in movements for Black liberation. The better the system is, the more they complain, Maslow moaned, like emancipated Negroes now who are suddenly not satisfied with what would have seemed ideal a decade ago. Maslow greeted the end of Jim Crow with approval, but he worried that, quote, Negroes seemed to be not striving, not ambitious, not self-improving or environment improving. Rather than taking continued political mobilization as evidence of the fact that important needs remained unmet in the Black community, Maslow insisted that it demonstrated that most people remained permanently locked in a supposedly lower motivational pattern, even when their circumstances improved. What about the people who did manage to ascend the hierarchy and orient themselves towards self-actualization? Maslow could no longer maintain that they were simply fortunate enough to have had their lower needs fulfilled. With time, he found it impossible to resist the conclusion that at least some self-actualizers were simply innately superior. In the 1960s, Maslow began to postulate the existence of what he called a biological elite, a group with an inborn propensity for all the positive traits associated with self-actualization. The 5% of the general population who run themselves and the world, as he put it. I guess I'm a little Nietzschean about the Superman, the elite, the superior species, he confessed in his journal. There are those with IQs over 180 who are qualitatively different, almost a separate species. The good news in Maslow's mind was that these Übermenschen could help their less well-endowed subordinates to break through the limitations that trapped them in an inferior motivational structure. This was how Maslow conceptualized his role as a teacher to an indulged, overrich, spoiled, blasé generation of college students. For their own good, he wrote in his diary, he would have to become the stern, distant, disapproving, punishing father. Maslow eventually concluded that the most important site for the exercise of this kind of psychologically ennobling leadership was not the classroom, but the workplace. While he had once, quote, thought of education as the best bet for changing the society, he journaled, now it was his view that the work situation seems even better because everybody works. The archetype of the leader in the work situation was what Maslow called the entrepreneur. The model for Maslow's views on the entrepreneur was Andrew Kay, the founder of a San Diego technology company called Nonlinear Systems, who hired Maslow as a consultant in the early 1960s. Maslow had no doubt that Kay was a self-actualizing person, an extremely interesting, capable, and intelligent man, also a strong man. The result of Kay's entrepreneurial direction, in Maslow's judgment, was a high level of psychological health throughout NLS. Small men, Maslow wrote, become heroes by participation in heroic enterprise. NLS was one such heroic enterprise, a place where it was possible for individuals to pursue self-actualization via a commitment to an important job and to worthwhile work. The expansion of heroic work that employees could legitimately take pride in required, quote, superior people like Kay. The entrepreneur, the organizer, the spark plug, Maslow wrote, was the active leader upon whom everything depends. Entrepreneurs needed to play this leadership role internationally as well as in the United States, Maslow maintained. Quote, the most valuable 100 people to bring into a deteriorating society, like for instance, Peru, would be not 100 chemists or politicians or professors or engineers, but rather 100 entrepreneurs, he mused. Many underdeveloped countries, he argued, quote, would have to be administered and grown by an elite from above for some time. A rising standard of living would mean little unless a strong elite was present to translate affluence into psychological maturity. It would be too simple to say that Maslow's deepening conservatism and his burgeoning obsession with entrepreneurship was caused by his changing interpretation of the hierarchy of needs. But it is significant that the two went hand in hand. If conservative rhetoric often takes the form of what Albert Hirschman called the futility thesis, the idea that even the most sophisticated reforms can never make a dent in the problems they aim to address, the futility thesis is almost ineluctably couched in terms of claims about human nature. And since the early 20th century, psychology has served as the hegemonic vocabulary for claims about human nature. As Maslow's career suggests, this elective affinity between conservatism and the sciences of human nature imbues a certain fragility to leftist political economic ideologies built on psychological microfoundations. Any argument for social transformation that rests on determinative predictions about the way individuals are likely to respond to their circumstances is fatally vulnerable to the inexhaustible capacity of human beings for surprise. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Erik. Wonderful. And I think excellent connections between all the three papers. So if you want to ask a question to one or more of the panelists, please raise your hand. Simon?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question for Erik, and maybe that might help us connect the papers even more. So you were talking about Maslow's sort of ideas of entrepreneurship that he got from Kay. I'm wondering, like, is there any sort of like longer genealogy to these? I mean, I know that I guess I'm inviting you to talk about your other work on ideas of entrepreneurship in the earlier 20th century, and like to what extent can we see links between those ideas and then K, and then Maslow, or it's like a separate genealogy. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes. So as Simon is alluding to, this is one story that I tell in my dissertation, which is about the history of the concept of entrepreneurship in management science in the 20th century US. So the kind of family tree genealogy is as follows. The vocabulary of the entrepreneur for Maslow was really inherited from a Harvard psychologist called David McClelland, who wrote a book called The Achieving Society in the early 1960s. He was a student of Henry Murray, also worked within this sort of needs psychology framework that was the kind of United States elaboration of a lot of these Viennese interwar ideas. And McClelland, in turn, probably learned about the entrepreneur from the Harvard Research Center on Entrepreneurial History, which was established at Harvard Business School by Joseph Schumpeter at the end of his life, along with Arthur Cole and a few of the other business historians there that McClelland was involved with. So Schumpeter right there gives you a connection back to Werner Sombart and Max Weber and this world of early 20th century German language, social science. So the genealogy, in if indirect, is actually quite straightforward, I think, and so I think that helps to explain the resonance between Maslow's view, Maslow's conceptualization of the entrepreneur and its strong sort of valence of leadership in the work of scholars like Sombart, for example.
Steve?
Yeah, this is a question for Max. We all know about the influence of Mises and other Vienna ideas on the London School of Economics in the 1930s, after Robbins started importing that stuff in a big way. And there was a project, excuse me, at the LSE in the 1930s, I think actually initiated by Arnold Plant, and taken up by Ronald Fowler, and in written form by Fowler and Coase, on accounting. And it's interesting because there's nothing I've seen in it that I can recall about socialist calculation and that sort of angle on things. Excuse me. Although one could make up a story that connects these dots very neatly, given what we know about these people. But what this project showed was that accounting is more or less useless. That is, that accountants don't know how to measure costs. The basic rules of accounting are garbage in terms of reflecting opportunity costs and so on. And so I guess my question is, I just wonder if you've sort of run into anything about the linkage between the stuff you're dealing with here and that LSE project in the 1930s. Thank you.
That's an excellent suggestion, Steve. I have not seen this project. I don't know anything about this project specifically, but what I can say is that this increasing skepticism about accounting and its ability to accurately measure production costs, which are increasingly seen as subjective and future-oriented in a dynamic economy, is exactly the kind of transition that I'd like to explore in my thesis. I think it's clear, and I tried to bring this out in my presentation today on Mises, that in the 1910s and 20s, accounting is seen as necessary and sufficient for economic rationality because it is the source of estimates of production costs, even though Mises is perfectly aware of the shortcomings of any accounting measure. He still believes that the calculation of a return on capital based on production costs and accounting sense is adequate for a rational allocation of resources. And I think that comes out of his intellectual context and the obsession with accounting in that period in the German-speaking world. But by the time the debate gets to the English-speaking world, and these texts are translated into English and Hayek takes it up, I think it's a different point of view. I think it's just a completely different point of view. So I think that your suggestion will, have to be incorporated into my work one way or another. So thank you.
Steve, just to be sure, you're also referencing Buchanan's Cost and Choice in that respect, right? Because that, of course, is very much about this subject, or
Yeah,
not?
yeah, it is. But there's a whole series of articles that Coase wrote in a magazine, London magazine called The Accountant in 1938, that lays this out. There's a paper with Ronald Fowler around the same time. I've got a chapter on this, or part of a chapter in my book on Coase. And so a lot of this is vague. I was actually, reading through some stuff really quickly while Max was talking. But then, yeah, the Buchanan stuff later sort of reaches back to that, and this is part of why, one of the several reasons Buchanan liked Coase so much. Although Buchanan disliked Coase because he seems to have forgot about opportunity costs when he wrote The Problem of Social Costs and became Marshallian.
Teresa.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting ensemble of presentations. Of course, Visa was always running in dialogue to all your presentations, especially the last two ones. And so my questions come from studying Visa and not only his connections to psychologists, but also philosophers. First, to Erik, I think Visa has a very similar view on the role of the elite or leadership in the installation of new constitutions or new political or economic systems. So that would be really interesting to compare. He also relied heavily on Nietzsche, so that was really interesting. And I wanted to ask you whether Walter Littman played any role in Maslow's or other theorists you were looking at. And the second one to Simon. Visa and introspection is central for Visa. I don't know if you knew that, but it's just his central method, which he elaborates in his later works. And he is not so much into calculating and calculating pleasure or value, but in the moments or in the references where he does that, or where he's discussing calculating value, for example, he references Gustav Theodor Fechner and the tradition of psychophysics. And this he has in common with Ernst Mach, who has a lot in common with Friedrich Wieser, for example, and who very favorably is discussing introspection as well. So I wondered, because Ehrenfeld is a different tradition, Wundt, of course, comes from this very also physical, empirical tradition in psychology, if you could touch upon the link to psychophysics as well. Thank you, Erwin.
Thanks. Yes, I think it's a very well observed connection. I discuss Visa very briefly in the article in Modern Intellectual History I published recently on the origins of what I call entrepreneurial management theory. I mean, certainly for someone like Joseph Schumpeter, Visa is an extremely important touchstone for thinking about the relationship between entrepreneurship and leadership. In terms of Walter Littman, he's an interesting figure because in some ways he's more admired. I mean, certainly by the 1930s and 1940s, he's more admired. He's taken a bit more seriously as an intellectual outside of the United States, and that's in part because by this time he is, he's primarily writing as a newspaper columnist, and is very widely read and very influential. But someone like Maslow, who was extremely, as you can tell, very elitist sort of thought, ascribed genius to a very narrow stratum of thinkers. He probably would have seen Littman as a bit vulgar, even if it would be surprising if he had never read any of his work, just because he was such a popular writer in the mid-century period.
Simon?
Yeah, thanks. Your point about the visa connection is very well taken. I don't think I have a good enough knowledge to sort of properly, think about the Fechner link. But I think that, I guess just a tentative answer would be, or I think is that the interesting thing about psychophysics is that there is at least a kind of like hope that there's some kind of empirical relation between what's happening in the world and what's happening in the mind, and some possibility of measurement. And I think by the time of the period that I'm talking about, there seems to be much more skepticism about that relationship, that or at least that there's no possibility of access to it, right? And that's kind of one of the premises for what I'm talking about. But I think I definitely take your point that there's this other sort of tradition, and I think that's one I would have to sort of fully flesh out to, so thank you.
William, for the next question.
Hi, thanks, Max, Simon, and Erik, for a fascinating sort of paper. So I have sort of a general comment, and maybe a couple more specific questions. I was just really struck in Erik's paper by, the kind of payoff of the Maslow story in some ways is about how kind of this making subjective notions of value opens up this possibility for then making claims about basically the superiority of individuals, right? That if different people kind of have different ways of ranking and sort of judging value, then it seems to kind of create this possibility that some people do it better than others. And it's something actually I've come across in my own research on intertemporal choice. I think if you look at kind of in some of the later 20th century research that sort of feeds in, coming out of the behaviorist tradition, work by people like Richard Herrnstein, feeding into kind of behavioral economics, there is this sort of implicit sense that if you can kind of figure out a way to measure people's different sort of time preferences, then it's kind of implicitly a way to kind of rank as who is more sort of thrifty and ethical and kind of a better capitalist subject in some ways. So I'm just curious from Simon in particular, but also I think this may touch on Max's question. Did you see a similar, in some of the work, people like Kuhl and some of the earlier thinkers, is there sort of this implicit sense that kind of in these subjective notions of value, there is also a kind of a normative, ranking, right? That, people may kind of have different preferences, but some people's preferences are more meritorious than others. I think that's that seems to be kind of where Maslow ends up. So that would be one question. I'm also just sort of curious about this question of kind of time and the future. Part of this comes out of my own interest in futurity and intertemporal choice, but it's a theme that runs through all of these kind of subjective theories of value. So I'd be curious if anyone has any comments on that. But so those would be the two questions. Like, is subjective value this kind of backdoor for sort of ranking people? And then questions about time and future.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing in the context of Maslow is that, in some ways this is the arc of the story, that he has, initially he develops, what is the hierarchy? A hierarchy of, it's a hierarchy of needs arranged in order of this concept of prepotency, which is at least initially presented as a purely descriptive concept. But then when Maslow begins to question, and then in my view, basically abandon that descriptive concept of prepotency, he's still left in with a hierarchy, and so it certainly has that function of normative evaluation for him, and I don't think that he quite I don't think that he quite came to terms with the fact that he had sort of shifted between descriptive and sort of normative or evaluative modes in his understanding of the nature of this hierarchy, in part because it would have been a blow to his own ego to admit that he may have, gotten something wrong earlier in his career. I think the point about time is I think also important. I mean, where it shows up is in his obsession with this idea that contemporary American consumers were obsessed with immediate gratification as opposed to delayed gratification and the ability to sort of subordinate the kind of immediate satisfaction of their baser needs in order to pursue these longer term projects of self-actualization. So I think that there's definitely a temporality, a temporal dimension to the way that certain needs are conceptualized as like lower or higher. The lower needs are the ones that have a shorter temporal horizon in a way, and conversely for the higher needs.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's interesting, on the question of normative rankings and people having better than others, I didn't see much, or I didn't really see that in the Viennese, the Austrian material I was looking at. If anything, I think the fear was from people like Mises was very much, removing any kind of normative, because that was coming from the left. So, no, let's disinfect our, economic science from such things. But then what's interesting is when you look at, for instance, how these ideas get taken up in Robbins, which is, Stephen mentioned earlier, the influence on LSE in the 30s. What always struck me in his essay, and when he introduces the problem of interpersonal comparisons of utility, is the example he uses to do so is a conversation between a Brahmin and a lower caste individual. And the Brahmin says, well, how do you know I don't, get 100 times more pleasure from X thing than you do? And Robbins uses this as a sort of like self-evident example for the fact that we can't make interpersonal comparisons. And so I don't really know what to do with that, but I find it totally fascinating that this kind of racialized, orientalized story is the one that's deployed as the sort of self-evident example for why we shouldn't or ought not make interpersonal comparisons. And I haven't fully, I don't have a full, but I just find that really interesting, and it's not something I saw in the Viennese material. So yeah.
I would love to answer this question because I think it's really astute. And in fact, Erik and I were having an exchange previously about the relationship between subjective value and normative conceptions of the good life, the virtuous person, etc. A lot of contemporary interpreters of Neurath would like to say that he wanted to subject these considerations of value to some kind of democratic process, and to take them out of the realm of the market so that they could be deliberated over. But it might also be the case that Neurath, in fact, had a very clear view of what the correct answer was for questions of subjective value. And I think that for the left, at least for some figures on the left in the 10s and 20s, the Austrian School of Economics raised concerns about subjective valuation that seemed beside the point, simply because in the socialist state, ordinary humans would be converted into Neue Menschen, and they would have a new set of values which would be determined and predictable. And Neurath was suspected of authoritarianism by others on the left who did not share this view. And he was suspected of being a militarist and a romantic socialist who wanted to combine socialism with some kind of medievalist program in which certain needs were clearly regarded as more important than others, etc. And so I suppose this simply leads to two comments. One is that leftists in the 20s and 30s rejected this view when, as the consequences became clearer and fascism became a real threat, and they started to develop market socialist conceptions in which freedom of occupation and consumption would be retained, and that was absolutely crucial. And the other comment is that perhaps Maslow did not change so much, because perhaps, I don't know that much about him, Erik, maybe you can tell me I'm wrong, but perhaps he was always, committed to this kind of backward-looking leftism, in which the purpose of a socialist state was not merely to establish human freedom, but in fact to impose the normatively correct subjective valuations in people, and thus enable a planned economy.
Erik, you want to respond very briefly to that,
Sure.
and then we move to
Sure.
the next
Yeah.
question?
Briefly, I mean, I do think that it's important to the story that Maslow begins in this leftist milieu. It's not incidental, and clearly he doesn't abandon everything about the way that he's conceptualizing psychology and society from this period. I mean, that being said, he at least him understood himself to be shifting from left liberalism to conservatism. So I think that we should, to some extent, defer to him and our ascription of these political categories.
Okay, thank you. I just this is very shameless, but I want to emphasize that in my Viennese students, I do make the argument that a lower time preference is a mark of civilization for Bembarek and Mises, and so also for Menger. So this idea that you produce higher order goods and you plan further ahead in the future has a sort of normative connotation about being more forward-looking rather than less forward-looking. Haro.
Yes, thanks for 3 extremely inspiring presentations. I think I have a question for Max and Simon. I think first for Max. I'm a bit puzzled by 2 things, actually. One related to Sombart and the other to Mises. Sombart, it seems that, how can I put it? It's almost as if you make a strong, or Mises perhaps, makes a very strong distinction between instruments and the mind, if I may put it that way. You have an accounting tool that may function mechanical, but that doesn't say anything about the working of the mind or interests. But the working of the mind is independent of that instrument. And I'm not quite sure. Perhaps I stated wrong, but if I think about Sombart, accounting is equal to rationality is mechanical, then I wonder about one of Sombart's heroes and about his writing on the bourgeois spirit, in which he takes up Benjamin Franklin's Art of Virtue, which is transformative of Franklin himself. So you have a tool, it's an accounting tool, it's accounting moral virtue, but it's also transforming the person of Benjamin Franklin himself. And Sombart takes this procedure, but also Franklin, as the quintessential embodiment of the bourgeois spirit. And so I have difficulty in relating that to a mechanical or simply a mechanical way of seeing accounting. It does something with the person. So perhaps you could say something to that. The other thing that I would like to ask something about, and that relates to Simon, is that if you, as you, Max, show nicely, if you are a calculating mind, you can calculate in different units. It's not necessarily money. It can be time, labor time. It can be other units. So it's not quite clear to me why, and that's a sort of, I had to think of this cartoon of a mathematical proof and then a miracle happens. And I saw that in Simon's, a quote Simon gave about the coordination of actions, which arises out of the interplay of subjective evaluations. And of course, it's a quote that you give, and then a miracle happens. So that's how I read it. And Simon, you yourself suggest also in relation to Neurath that you can have other ways of coordination, democratic, authoritarian. There are different ways of doing it. So the link, say, between von Mises' emphasis on interests and money, to take a shortcut, if you want to express these interests, then you can't do that in a planning system, but you have to do that via something with the market, and then it expresses itself in money. It's not quite clear to me. Well, I'm not quite sure I'm getting at a very clear question, but there are two things. The one is this relation of accounting and transforming the mind, and the other is this seems to be a completely separate issue of how you coordinate activities.
Simon, would you like to try to answer that question, or should I try to answer it?
I can start. I have to say, I'm not sure I understood exactly, but if I on this question of coordination, I think someone can correct me and who has more knowledge of Mises, but my understanding is it wasn't necessarily that. Well, the problem is that in the article, there's a kind of laundry list of arguments. So which ones have priority for Mises is less clear. It's really kind of a list of charges, and so he both seems to say A, that any coordination except through money is impossible, which we can debate, and B, even if other kinds of coordination were possible, they would be undesirable because they will be imposing like authoritarian preferences. So there seems to be both arguments happening at once in the article, and maybe someone who knows more can tell me which one is more operative in other parts of his work. But in the article, what's interesting is that there really seems to be both arguments going on, and they're somewhat in tension with one another. But at least what I was trying to argue in my paper, and it's possible I misunderstood your question, was that from Mises' perspective, the problem with other kinds of coordination is that because ultimately people's states of feeling or wants or preferences are inaccessible, then any kind of coordination that isn't this kind of informal play of subjective valuation that creates prices and creates money would have some element of coercion or external imposition of preferences, and so that we can only do it informally. And anyway, so I mean, what's interesting is then Neurath actually accepts that premise, but says, okay, but then we have to deliberate. Although maybe if Max is right, then it's more complicated than that. But anyway, so I'm not sure if I fully answered, but that would be a provisional answer. But I'll let Max take over.
Yeah, yes, I think it's an excellent question, Haro, because of course your question speaks directly to Mises' most basic beliefs, and I think the enigma or the puzzle of his argument against socialist calculation, because he states that accounting requires a common denominator, and then he states that this common denominator must be money. And it's somewhat unclear, I think, why he believes that to be the case. But without attempting to answer your question in any way that's satisfactory, I can give my summary of what I think Mises believed. For one reason or another, he thought that money prices were the only way of rendering people's subjective interests and valuations objective. And he furthermore believed that money prices, it would be mistaken to say that money prices measured these valuations. it was actually that money prices simply were identical to the valuations or something like that. And so in that sense, your suggestion that accounting and money prices have nothing to do with what's going on in the mind is certainly something that I personally agree with and am sympathetic to, but Mises would have rejected that, I think. Mises would have said, no, in fact, we can only speak about interests to the extent that they are actualized in money prices, something like that. And I think that we just have to do a little more research, all of us, to understand why he believed that. Because I think it probably has to do with his relationship to Kuhl, but also to Georg Simmel, who makes a very similar argument in the philosophy of money. And there's a wonderful but totally bizarre passage in Mises' theory of money and credit on the pear, the apple, the piece of cake, and the glass of lemonade, which some of you might know, but that would be the place to start. And Mises says, well, if the price of the glass of lemonade changes, then the person's own valuation subjectively of the glass of lemonade changes relative to the apple, which is totally inconsistent with Austrian value theory is how I understand it, but I think there might be more to the story there. And so then, I think that also is a way of answering the question about Zombart too. Yes, accounting does transform the person. Yes, accounting is profoundly related to what is happening inside the mind, in the soul. Accounting, changes people's valuations and changes people's interests in a way that makes them more rational. This process of objectifying the wants and the desires makes the person more rational and changes their spiritual makeup. And so it's definitely not mechanical in that sense, although that was the term that Zombart used. Was that any good, Haro? What do you think?
That was very good, Max. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're almost at the end of the session. So we have 2 minutes left, which I'm going to use to say something myself, very immodestly. I first want to plug the work of Alexander Linspiegler, if people are not familiar with it. I put a link in the chat, who also compares Mises and Neurath on rationality, so I think which might be of interest to most of us here. I think my question is mostly about Max's paper, but therefore also about Simon's, and picks up on Haro's remark. And that is that I think that Mises' there is an inherently social dimension to the value theory of the later Austrians, which is not necessarily there in Menger. So I just wrote an article on the theory of wants in Menger's second edition, and it in fact tracks Simon's story a lot better. So it in fact goes the entire route that Franz Kuhel does. So he doesn't have the separation of economics and psychology, you might say, because he wants to track it all the way down to biological roots into individual wants and how they translate. And he wants to say something about the process of cognition and knowledge that is required to recognize that there's an unease which needs to be alleviated, and then a certain good might be required in order to alleviate that, and so on and so forth. So he has the whole thing. Whereas what I think happens in Mises, and then particularly in Hayek, but we could say in Hayek's reading of Mises, is that all of this theory of the mind goes out, right? And even in Mises, this is very clearly because praxeology says virtually nothing about a theory of the mind, right? It says something about having a social purpose, but it says nothing about the process of calculation, which is still quite prominent in the material that Max now demonstrated. And then when we get to Hayek, right, all the calculation actually happens outside of the mind and outside of the individual, because it's the market mechanism or the price mechanism that's doing all the work. And it's mentioned as a calculating device, right? It's a piece of technology that's outside of the human mind. So the human mind in somehow, yeah, I understand this, and I know this is anachronistic, but I understand this through the more recent work on the extended mind. And Hayek makes these links, references Whitehead, that civilization progresses as more and more stuff gets sort of offloaded onto the environment. And Now, one might think of double entry bookkeeping as an early instance of this process of offloading. But I do think it's somehow important to both Max and your paper to be a bit more precise about what happens inside the individual mind and what is enabled by the sort of social techniques that are available. And the necessity of having the price system in society, right, is a sort of the need for a kind of social technology that enables society to be rational rather than merely the individual to be rational, which I think Max emphasized very strongly in his story.
Yeah, just very, very briefly, just say that I think that's totally right. And I think that what's very interesting to me is, so my own dissertation doesn't take the Austrian story much further. It doesn't go into high, but where I do go is, into neoclassical economics, LSE school, etc., and then Samuelson. And it's not the same story, but it's a similar story of withdrawing totally from questions of the mind. In fact, saying it's not our problem, right? And by the time you get to, Samuelson in the late 30s, he's even trying to embrace behaviorism or operationalism and say, it's let's divorce these questions completely. And so it's an interesting process where what's so fascinating to me about this turn of the century moment in Austria is that there is still an attempt to provide this kind of like psychological explanation for economic questions, which then falls away. So yeah.
Okay, then I would like to thank all the speakers for what, in my perspective, really was an amazing session. Great coherence, wonderful discussions afterwards. So thanks very much, Max, Erik, and Simon, and hope to see you in further sessions during the conference.
Especially to Max for organizing.
Thank you all for joining us. Take care.